Last speaker, Nicolas Lusiani. Nicolas is Director of the Human Rights in Economic Policy Program at the Center for Economic and Social Rights. His work focuses on developing alternative human rights center economic and development policies. Nico.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to respond to what's been a rich and varied discussion on the cusp of this Addis Ababa Accord. I think one of the emerging lessons here is that three principles should inform the FfD negotiations. A failure of any of these three would be a failure of all. The first being sufficiency of resources, the second being the equitable use and generation of those resources, and thirdly, the accountability of these resources. All of these are in line with international law and existing human rights standards. And I want to focus on this last principle of accountability and present one proposal to build in a lever of cross-border accountability for the Addis Ababa Accord. But first, let me start with a brief story. Last week, I was part of a team of tax experts, accountants, and human rights lawyers to investigate tax abuses in the mining sector in a low-income country in southern Africa. This is a country where half of its people, men, but especially women and children, live in grinding poverty, despite an abundance of precious minerals, which literally hardwire the global economy and our ability to communicate in this very room. It's a country whose revenue authority, with impressive help from donors, has significantly boosted its capacity to track the losses stemming from tax abuses by international mining companies. Yet at the end of the day, the country's capacity to mobilize these mining resources for sustainable development stops at their national borders. Yes, tax administration and capacity building in this field works, but it has its limits. International mining companies that operate under the soil of this country make use of various vehicles and financial secrecy jurisdictions to shield their tax liabilities in the country. We were shown evidence of aggressive tax planning and outright fraud equaling possibly $2 billion of lost revenue, to the point where you question whether some of these companies' business model is based on tax avoidance. This loss of precious financing in this country is not just a threat to the government's starving revenue base, but it also undercuts the country's ability to redistribute and reverse the growing economic and gender inequalities. It also deepens mistrust in how fiscal policy is governed and how effective this can be, especially for the most disadvantaged. So all the best work and money went into and continues to go into equipping the revenue authorities with more technical expertise and resources. This should be strengthened and emboldened. Yet, so far, a lot of this has resulted in this country knowing how much it's hemorrhaging, but not having the tools to actually stem the bleeding. Beyond vague international commitments, the Addis Ababa Accord should instill concrete deliverable actions by those countries facilitating this cross-border tax abuse, to prevent it, to investigate it, and to put an end to it. The draft Addis Ababa Accord supports many key elements for improved international tax transparency. But tax transparency itself does not guarantee the kind of accountability that's enshrined under international and European Union law, which oblige governments to ensure their tax policies and practices support and not undermining the full resourcing of human rights beyond their borders. This is especially the case in an unbalanced and chaotic international tax regime. So we propose a simple idea to instill more accountability over international taxation. If countries have nothing to hide, then why not conduct periodic impact assessments to show and prove that their tax policies, laws, and international agreements have no foreseeable negative effects abroad? The Netherlands has already conducted this type of exercise. Ireland is doing so now. Why not make this a standard across influential countries? These impact assessments would monitor the spillover effects of tax policies and agreements on the achievement of sustainable development goals in other countries. They could be periodic and independently verified, with public participation in defining the risks and the potential extraterritorial impacts of tax policies. To live up to the integrated nature of the SDGs, these impact assessments should analyze not only the revenue implications of these spillovers, but also the distributive and governance spillover effects of a country's tax policies and practices. Finally, once identifying very clearly the main problems that create an undermining of the tax abuse overseas, these impact assessments should trigger policy action by including explicit recommendations for remedies and redress for any negative impacts discovered, and clear deadlines for action. Such spillover analysis could potentially serve as a pillar of the FfD's monitoring and review process by providing both regular accountability and remedial action to ensure that all governments, especially the most powerful and influential in the international tax system, are held to account to the Addis Ababa Accord we're all working so hard to enshrine. Let's add an extra A to the Addis Ababa Accord to make it the Addis Ababa Accountability Accord. Thank you.